Right. So, time to shift gears just a little bit to how we're actually going to go through the process of planning now to do the spread that we're going to do throughout our operating rooms. And I can't emphasize to you enough how important it is to think about this carefully before you do it and to plan carefully. This is one of those times in life where the first shot is the best shot. And things probably, for all of us, when we do this kind of work, things don't always go as we anticipate. But the better prepared we are and the more we can try and anticipate and avoid big problems during this phase in particular, the smoother it's likely to go. I'm sure that you know in nearly every hospital that there are going to be pockets of people who maybe aren't as enthusiastic about this as other folks are. You might call those people resistant, although I hate that word because I'm not sure that they're really resistant. A lot of times they don't understand what you're trying to do and don't necessarily agree with it because of a lack of understanding, but it doesn't matter. Every hospital is going to have folks like that. And we want to make sure that we handle the way that we introduce it to the entire operating room in the best way possible right out of the block. So these are some basic principles to think about as we go ahead. And the first one we've been talking about since the very beginning, and that's the principle of start where it's easy. In any quality improvement project, you always want to start where it's easy. You don't pick the hardest problem to solve until you've figured out how to solve problems. You don't pick the most difficult people to work with until you've figured out how to work with people who want to work with you. It just makes sense. So you start with the surgeon of the service that you think will be the most open. Now, are our predictions always right? No. Do we sometimes think that people might go along with us and agree with us and then find out that it backfires and they really weren't as enthusiastic as we thought? Absolutely. But the whole idea here is to try and minimize as best we can those kind of issues by working with people who we think want to work with us first. So this is when I want you to start to work with that personnel spreadsheet where you already have been one at a time trying to talk to people ahead of time. I want you to somehow on a whiteboard or using a spreadsheet or on a piece of paper list the surgical services that your hospital offers. And this is particularly true for the larger hospitals. And then rank them in order of the difficulty that you would anticipate in doing the next phase or introducing the checklist to their operating room. Now, it's a very subjective judgment. And like I said, sometimes people surprise us. And the ones that we think are going to be the hardest end up being the easiest. But most of the time, if you work in an operating room and you've had to change things before, you have a pretty good idea about who's open to change and who's a little bit harder to bring along. So we want to start easy and end hard. We want to stay organized. And by being organized, I mean we want to create a timeline. But I say that with a really important caveat, and that is I want you to remain flexible. So if you make a timeline and you start to do the work and you find out for your hospital that it's taking a little bit longer or that it's a little bit easier than you thought it might be, feel that it's okay to go ahead and modify the timeline that you're going to use to roll it out. You can stretch it out, or if you feel like it's possible, you can compress it a little bit. So make a timeline so that you put a goal out there for yourself and you have some organization around this, but at the same time be flexible. Give enough time for people to do the work. Usually it takes longer than you think it will. to be able to adequately introduce the checklist to a service or to a room in the hospital, in the operating room. But give yourself time to stretch it out if you need to. Assign a member of the checklist implementation team to the area that's going to be using the checklist. So if you're going to start on the general surgery service, somebody from the implementation team needs to keep an eye on what's going on as the checklist is introduced to the general surgery service. Those people need to be available to talk to the surgical teams and to troubleshoot any problems that come up. The worst thing that can possibly happen is to put something on autopilot without somebody available around to deal with problems as they arise. And in the beginning, most of the time, the problems are misunderstandings, a lack of clarity in the preparation that's done up to this point in time. Sometimes it's because somebody didn't get talked to ahead of time. Sometimes it's because even though that conversation occurred, that the person on the other end misunderstood what exactly it was that you were trying to say. Now, hopefully, by seeing examples of people using a checklist and by having that one-on-one conversation, we will have walked around most of those barriers as we have prepared to do the work. But there are always problems as you work through, particularly a larger operating room.